Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove here today with another video, and today I'm going to be taking a look at my top 5 favourite Spider-Man omnibuses in my collection. Now this was a really kind of tricky one for me to do because as a big Spider-Man fan, I've got to say that all of the Spider-Man omnibuses that I own are books that I really enjoy. So to pick out just 5 that I think stand above the others is a really difficult challenge, but certainly the ones that I've got here today set aside, the ones I'm going to take a look at in this video, are books that I do really think are particularly great reads, at least for me personally. So what I'm going to do is start off by taking a look at the very beginning of Spider-Man, because I couldn't put a list like this together without acknowledging the importance of the very beginning of Spidey's history. What I've got here, of course, is the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 1, featuring the complete run by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. And this is just such a special run, you know. I mean, I am admittedly a big fan of Silver Age Spider-Man. I know that this era is not going to be for everybody because these are admittedly, you know, very old comics now, going back 60 years in this case. But this is something that is so unique compared to, I think, the beginning of just about any other major comic book character, because you see so many key significant appearances occur during these early issues. It's just a creative period that's almost unparalleled in my opinion. You know, compared to almost any other character that you take a look at in comic book history. Because during this Lee and Ditko run, you just get so many key appearances. You get characters like the Vulture, Doc Ock, the Lizard, the Scorpion, Sandman, Electro, Kraven the Hunter, and supporting characters like obviously Aunt May, Gwen Stacy, Flash Thompson, Harry Osborn. You know, just so many key significant appearances occur during here. It's really kind of crazy when you look at these first 38 issues of Amazing Spider-Man and realize just how many of the key elements of Spider-Man that, you know, make the character what he is, all originating from these very early years. But as well as simply that being the fact, there's just also the case that these comics are just really fun to enjoy. You know, I genuinely believe that this is the very best of Marvel's Silver Age comics. I mean, the only thing that I think comes close is the Fantastic Four. But even so, I don't think that was quite as strong, because with Spider-Man, I do think that from the very beginning, this series just hit the ground running, got off to a really strong start, and really nailed that whole element of characters with realistic problems that Stan Lee talked about so often as being his key inspiration for these superheroes during the 60s. I don't think that was ever any more successful than it was with Spider-Man, and these early issues in this particular omnibus are still really very fun to read through. Yes, they're dated, obviously that's the case. You know, when you're going back this far, there's going to be references and language that doesn't quite always stand the test of time, maybe. But to me, that's all stuff that, if anything, it only makes these comics a little bit more endearing. Yes, there's a cheesiness to it. They're not obviously quite the same as reading modern comics, but nobody ever quite drew Spider-Man like Steve Ditko, I'll tell you that. And even though he's not my favourite Spider-Man artist, because, spoiler alert, I'm going to reveal my favourite Spider-Man artist in the next pick, but he's certainly, I think, the most unique Spider-Man artist. He was obviously the co-creator of the character, and if it wasn't for him, quite frankly, we probably would never have Spider-Man as we know him today. So a huge acknowledgement has to go to the work of Steve Ditko, as well as obviously Stan Lee, because he gave this character his iconic voice, that kind of classic style of banter that Spider-Man has, that's often joking around and being the kind of goofball kind of character that he is, as well as this particular sequence that always deserves being highlighted from Amazing Spider-Man issue 33, with Spider-Man stuck beneath the machinery. Just one of the most iconic sequence of pages in all of comic book history by Steve Ditko here, with Spidey gradually realizing his true strength and overcoming adversity to finally lift this unbelievably massive chunk of machinery off himself, in just about one of the coolest splash pages that I've personally ever come across. So yeah, absolutely Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 1, a hugely significant book for the material collected in here, and something that's genuinely very fun to read in my opinion. Well worth checking out if you've never gone back to the beginning of Spidey history. But I mentioned that I was going to talk about my favourite Spider-Man artist in this next book, and we're sticking with the Silver Age, but I've got to talk about John Romita here with Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 2. So John Romita had the somewhat unenviable task of taking over the book from the co-creator and artist Steve Ditko. But in my opinion, there was never a better Spider-Man artist than this guy. John Romita was just, well, is still to this day an absolute legend. He's obviously still with us, but just beautiful, beautiful artwork in this particular run of issues in here. What was great about John Romita's artwork is, to me, it's just absolutely, it's just so aesthetically pleasing. You know, it's just beautiful on the eye. One thing that he always did, I think whether he could always help it or not, he always made the male characters in his stories just like super handsome. The female characters were always like incredibly beautiful. It's in these issues that Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane really come to prominence as supporting characters. Although Gwen Stacy had appeared towards the end of the Steve Ditko era, I would argue that it wasn't until these issues featuring John Romita as artist on the series that she really became significant. And then obviously had the first appearance of Mary Jane. Other key first appearances in here include the likes of the Rhino and the Kingpin. This particular omnibus does include issue 50, Spider-Man No More, which is, I think to this day, one of the most iconic Spider-Man stories there's ever been. It was the key inspiration for the Spider-Man 2 movie in the Sam Raimi trilogy. Here it is, issue 50. It was also the debut and first appearance of Kingpin, which for that matter is certainly significant in Marvel history. That's got to be said. But this is just a book, again, similar to with Volume 1. It's an era of Spider-Man that I get a huge amount of enjoyment out of reading. Again, yes, it's a dated book. Stan Lee's still writing this, and some of the material, the dialogue, it's not always free-flowing and supernatural necessarily. But I do think that this is really kind of a fun book to check out. And, I genuinely believe it, and I've said it a few times in previous videos, but I do think that Spider-Man was a series more so than others that really hit the ground running, and it's such a fascinating read to go through this earlier period of Spider-Man history and check out a lot of these issues. And as I flick through this book now, I'm just reminded of how much I really do enjoy and appreciate John Romita's art, because what you got to think as well is that really Romita set the standard style of Spider-Man comics that would be emulated for about 20 years after he'd left the book as the main artist, because I would argue that nobody came onto the book and shaked up the art style as much as John Romita did until Todd McFarlane came onto the book in the late 80s. Because every artist who kind of preceded John Romita pretty much stuck to this standard style. Artists like Gil Kane, Ross Andrew, John Romita Jr. even, obviously Romita Sr.'s son. They all did great work on this series, but they all kind of followed the template that Romita set, and that's because, quite frankly, Romita set an amazing high bar and a great standard of artwork for this series. So understandably, a lot of people kind of stuck to that style for a long time after this. But yeah, definitely another book well worth mentioning, right up there with the first volume, Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 2. A very, very good book, something that I hold in high regard. But if we move on to the third book, we'll jump forward a little bit in Spider-Man history. And I've got here the Spider-Man Omnibus by Roger Stern. Roger Stern really just a great writer, in general. But he came onto this book in the 80s. He had a great run on this series from 1980 to 1984. This particular omnibus is really quite massive. It's got about 1,300 pages, I think, all in all, including extras in the back. And it features Roger Stern's full run, which started off with quite a big chunk of issues of Spectacular Spider-Man, before he moved over onto Amazing Spider-Man being the main series. So this is a book of two quite distinctive halves, and I kind of summarised that in my full review of the book, because each of the books I'm talking about here I have reviewed in depth previously on the channel. The first half of this book, there or thereabouts, is the collection of Spectacular Spider-Man issues. And Spectacular Spider-Man, for those who don't know, was kind of like the B series, with Amazing Spider-Man being the main series. So in Spectacular, you had a generally less significant stories, I suppose you could say, to summarise them. Often less interesting villains, or less well-known villains at least. But what Spectacular Spider-Man kind of focused on was more Peter Parker's personal life, or developing some of the stories with Peter Parker rather than necessarily the larger ongoing Spider-Man narrative. So there's certainly some interesting stuff in here, but there are, it's got to be said, some far less interesting and memorable villains than what you're going to see in the issues of Amazing Spider-Man that feature in here. And I've got to point out that the issues of Amazing Spider-Man are certainly a step above the spectacular issues because, well, simply put, the Amazing Spider-Man was the main series. So that was a series in which you had more major things, more significant things occurring. And in that run of issues by Stern in here, which starts around about this point with issue 225, with this really cool cover, I always remember this, with this kind of pirate character. But you get such great stories in here as Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut, the Hobgoblin Saga obviously being a major one, and the Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, a short but poignant story, very memorable story in Spider-Man history. Get some appearances by the Black Cat as well, who at this point was still quite early in her publication history. And John Romita Sr. was working at, John Romita Jr. I should say, was working as the artist with Stern during this period of time. He was very much kind of, I would say, mimicking his dad's style on the book, because later on, and in more recent years, Romita Jr. has developed his own unique style, which is maybe not to everybody's tastes, and admittedly not to my taste so much, but this fairly early work they did on Amazing Spider-Man was really pretty cool. And this is just a good series of issues. I think that Stern was a writer who had a great handle on the character, and there's some really cool stories in here, including this one here, issue 236, which is one that maybe isn't all that highly regarded by the majority of people, but I always thought it was really cool. Because it just has such a disturbing ending, with a tarantula becoming an actual giant tarantula. But at the same time, he wasn't afraid to introduce some of the more silly characters in Marvel as well, like the Stilt Man, who we see in here. Just a really fun book, 80s Spider-Man, another great era. Stern's run on this book is one of those that's highly regarded amongst some of the best to ever take it on it. And I think, again, as I'm going to say with all these books, really, it's something that's well worth checking out if you've never gone ahead and read this before. The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, though, is here in issue 248. I'm not going to spoil that because that's such a powerful issue. If you've never read that, then I highly recommend that you do. It's a really quite a beautiful story, quite an emotional story. Yeah, really cool stuff again. If we move on to my fourth pick here, and this is The Amazing Spider-Man by David Michelini and Todd McFarlane. Now, McFarlane really came onto this book and shook things up, for better or worse, depending on your own personal opinion, I suppose. He drastically changed the art style, and artists that took on the book following on from his departure ultimately really kind of mimicked that style, and that led into the sort of the whole 90s extreme style of artwork that we saw dominating comics in general. But I'm a really big fan of this run, even though it doesn't necessarily contain too many significant stories besides the Venom stories, of course, which are collected in here, starting with this issue, Amazing Spider-Man issue 300, in which Venom kind of first appears, in full force for the first time. But this is just a really nice era of Spider-Man history, and I suppose because I'm one of those people with the not too original take that Spider-Man has not really been the same since the whole One More Day situation, with the breakup of him and Mary Jane. Going back to these early days of the Peter Parker and Mary Jane marriage, when she was, there and supporting him and was very much a comfort to him and a great supporting character, in my opinion, in that role. It's just really nice to kind of revisit that time and what was, in my opinion, a simpler and better time in Spider-Man comics. But yeah, this is just a fun book, and it was in fact the very first Marvel omnibus that I ever bought about 7 years ago, probably about 8 years ago actually now. Yeah, this was right at the very beginning. This particular book here, this specific version of this book, was something that I bought whilst it was out of print. And before I knew it, I was very much into the omnibus collecting game. So I suppose there's a bit of personal bias there. Always liked this cover as a great homage to the Action Comics cover, the Superman cover. with him lifting up that car like that. Really cool stuff. Yeah, it's a really interesting book because, like I say, you know, the Venom stories in here are really cool. The other stories in here are maybe not that memorable or significant overall in the grand scheme of things, but it's just a really fun book. I always enjoyed the era of Spider-Man, you know, the married years, you could call them, with Peter and MJ. I just always thought it was great that he had that kind of emotional support with her in his life. You know, at this point, she's fully aware of who he is. She's, you know, she's there to stand by him and support him through all the difficult things that he goes through. And at the same time, she's doing her own thing. You know, she's got a modelling career. She's like a soap opera actress. Yeah, really cool stuff. And then obviously McFarlane's art is just super distinctive, super unique to this day. He's by far one of the most unique artists that's ever taken on this series. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, he was the first artist to change the art style and direction of Amazing Spider-Man as drastically as he did since John Romita took over from Steve Ditko back in those early years. So I think well worth acknowledging the significance of this era. And he drew a really great Mary Jane, you know, that's got to be said. But just some cool stories, some cool stuff. It all ends up with this... This book kind of finishes off with this fairly long 6-part story, The Assassin Nation, featuring the Silver Sable, a story in which Captain America ultimately gets involved in as well. But just a book I can always have a good amount of fun revisiting and reading through these issues. I think it was a strong era of Amazing Spider-Man overall. So yeah, something that's had a couple of reprintings over the years. I'm not sure of the availability of the book now, but I do think it's something that's well worth checking out. And finally, I've got to talk about this. You know, if you've seen my reviews on this before, you're gonna know how much of a fan I am of Ultimate Spider-Man. Could have picked this or Volume 2 really, but I'm just gonna take this book as being representative of the entirety of Ultimate Spider-Man, because this is such a special series. I absolutely adore this series. Written, of course, by Brian Michael Bendis, artwork throughout, much of the series by Mark Bagley. And this is just so much fun, you know. It was at the time it was originally, you know, a modern reimagining of the origins of Peter Parker as Spider-Man, and then just retelling in many ways a lot of the classic stories with a modern spin on things. And it's just really, really good. You know, I'm not going to do it justice in the short summary I'm going to give it here, but it's really an enthralling read. It had me gripped and hooked on it from very early on. One thing that Bendis did so wonderfully throughout this run was give basically all the characters, the main characters, the minor characters, everyone in the supporting cast had a character arc and was really interesting to read, so that it didn't matter whether you were reading the Spider-Man action scenes or the Peter Parker stuff with Mary Jane or Gwen Stacy, or even, you know, more minor characters like Flash Thompson. Everybody had some kind of fascinating story arc going on at some point during this run. And it just all unfolded like one really cool, long story. You know, it does feel like you're reading one long epic from beginning to end. And that was, I suppose, really the benefit of having one writer stick on the book for the entirety of it, as Brian Michael Bendis did. I'm a huge fan of this series. Ultimate Spider-Man will always have a special place, I suppose, in my heart, because it was something that I found myself just really, really, really kind of immersed in from an early stage. I can only say that I'm really happy that this series is getting the omnibus treatment in the way that it is now. Initially with this first volume getting reprinted a year or two ago, then with the recent release of Volume 2, which I reviewed, the upcoming release of Volume 3, and I would assume not too long in the future, probably a Volume 4 as well, which will hopefully see things out and connect us to the Miles Morales omnibuses as well. But yeah, such a special series. Ultimate Spider-Man, well worth checking out, and a great jumping on point for any new readers who've never read Spider-Man before. Yeah, all the books on this list that I've talked about are ones that I very much hold in high regard. At the same time, there's plenty of other Spider-Man omnibuses that I could talk about. I have reviewed a whole number of Spider-Man omnibuses in the past on this channel, so you know, feel free to go back and take a look at other books I reviewed. I've got a playlist on the channel as well where I've collected them all together. But this is definitely amongst the most highly regarded by me. I absolutely adore this run, you know. Just this, I mean, this Venom run at the end of this first omnibus is really cool stuff. But yeah, that'll do it for now, I think. So that's, for the time being at least, my top 5 favourite Spider-Man omnibuses. Who knows if at some point in the future I'll do another list featuring Spider-Man books. There might be a couple of different ones on here, depending on what books we see released down the line. But thanks as always for watching. I appreciate that as always. And I'll be back again soon to discuss something else.